Thank you for attending the panel. I think you can probably already tell this is going to be a very interesting conversation just based on the people that are here. Oftentimes in these kind of things, someone stands up here and gives you a biographical explanation of everybody on the panel. But I'm pretty sure, first of all, that you know who these people are. And second of all, that they are probably better at identifying what they really want you to know about themselves than I would be. And especially because in this context, many of them have multiple accomplishments in their lives, maybe even various things that various areas where they've expressed themselves. But I specifically asked them to come here to talk about MIDI. So what I'm going to do, even though you do know them, is I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves and to do it in the following way, to mention obviously whatever it is about themselves that they are most proud of or they think that might be most relevant that they'd like you to know, but also to do so in the context of MIDI, namely what it is about MIDI that they think maybe they identify with most or they want to share with you most about their career or their personality or whatever. So let's start with, we'll just do this in order because, and by the way, there is no order to this whole thing, and I want to explain that in a number of ways. First of all, there's no order to the way they sat at the table. There's no order to the way they were listed here. It was totally random, and in fact, it wasn't even, I didn't even write it. Somebody else wrote it in this order. And there's probably no order to the way the discussion is going to go today because these are all very creative people, and I don't want to try to constrain them. I want them to be able to pretty much do whatever they want to do as long as it doesn't take all day. And I also want to have room at the end so that you guys can all ask questions of them. So let's begin with Jordan just because he's the closest to me. Again, introduce yourself and then it's kind of in the way of like what is, how, what, when, where, MIDI or something.
Right. Hey everybody, I'm Jordan Rudess, and it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today.
Are we all going to work this close to the mic?
Yeah, I think so, just to get a nice...
See what happens when you say there's no order?
You should be positioning the mics, actually. But yes, so I'm the keyboard player with Dream Theater these days. It takes up a lot of my time. I also have a company that makes apps, music apps for all kinds of different platforms. But in my path, basically I went from being a classical pianist at a very young age and then discovering synthesizers. My first synthesizer was a Mini Moog, and then from there quickly found my way into MIDI, and my life really changed. Just with the ability to actually have all that information going down the pike and playing something and then saying, well, I don't like that sound, and changing the sound and really getting into MIDI orchestration. And one thing I'll say before I pass the mic here over is that, at Juilliard, my focus was really on piano, and I studied composition. And I just dabbled a little bit with orchestration. I never really got into the whole thing. But when I discovered MIDI, it allowed me to become a kind of next generation orchestrator, if you will, that I'm sure a lot of us in the room can relate to. Because all of a sudden you have this orchestrational power that also has become a huge part of my life. To the point where if you come in my studio, there's keyboards lining on every wall and hanging from the ceiling and everything. And at times the MIDI information has been flying through the whole room. And it's a pretty cool world. Over to you, my friend.
Okay. Thanks, Jordan. I'm Dave Smith. I design musical instruments. That's my main passion. I've been doing it for quite a while now, since the late 70s, started with something called the Prophet 5. Prophet 5 was pretty much the first, I think, musical instrument with a microprocessor in it. And soon thereafter, everybody had microprocessors and instruments, and we all realized they could start talking to each other because that's what microprocessors are good at doing. And that's how we all got into what became MIDI. So MIDI, of course, has been a large part of everything we've done since. And I think there's a number of places in the NAMM show here that have something from the early 80s plugged into something that's current, and it works just fine, which is kind of cool. I haven't been really involved with the hard part of keeping MIDI going. That's left to people like Tom. I was involved in getting it going, and I kind of got away with it and went back to designing instruments. And again, that's my passion. And still doing it and still having fun with it. So, but MIDI was obviously a big part of it. It was back then when we put it together, the industry was very small. So it was actually possible to do something like MIDI, whereas if you tried to do it today, I think it would be a major headache and very difficult to do. But it was the right time at the right place, and we were all friends and competitors at the same time, and we got together and made it happen, and I think the industry grew just a tad bit since then, so MIDI was obviously a huge part of that. So.
Great, thanks.
Alan?
I think it was a terrible idea for people to introduce themselves. I mean, this is why we're here. Dave is the reason we're here. I mean, he invented MIDI, basically. I'm Alan Parsons. I'm an engineer and producer. More, please, no. MIDI has been very much part of my life, well, ever since the DX7, basically. I think that was my first encounter with it, but as we all know, it's become, a part of all our lives. Anybody who's in sound recording, and even somebody mentioned the fact that it's used for lighting control, even so. Anybody in entertainment is using MIDI these days. Dave was kind enough to take part in a recent DVD series I put together with a Santa Cruz company called Keyfax New Media. It's called The Art and Science of Sound Recording. So if you want to hear more about the early days of MIDI, you should maybe pick up those DVDs or stream them. Get the DVD or stream it or something. Good one. And Craig even gave it a really good review.
I gave it a really good review. And I'm tough. Believe me, I'm tough.
Anyway, over to you, Craig.
Thank you, Alan.
Nice segue. That was good.
I'm Craig Anderton, and I get to sit between George Duke and Alan Parsons, so that's And probably a lot of you know who I am. I've been involved with Electronic Musician Magazine, Harmony Central. But a couple things about MIDI. I actually wrote the first major book about MIDI. It was called MIDI for Musicians. And in the process, I got to chronicle how MIDI worked. At the time, I was doing some work with EMU, and I had access to their engineers who were designing the emulator too, and they knew all about MIDI. So I could call them up and say, hey, how does this particular thing work? And get all these stealth answers to these questions I needed to write the book. So so I learned about MIDI that way. I think the most interesting thing about MIDI to me, there's several things. Number one, the politics involved. There really wasn't any. I mean, there was to some extent. I remember having dinner with Dave Rossum at EMU, and he's saying, it's got to be Ethernet. Ethernet's really happening. And everybody had their own ideas, and Roland wanted something, and everybody, but they all got together. They all put their divisions aside. And it was just, I mean, to me, that's an incredible statement. In a world of VHS versus Beta and Mac versus Windows and all these other conflicts that we deal with, Ford versus GM, Tellys versus Les Pauls, whatever, the fact that an industry got together, made it happen, and that the MMA, bless their souls, have been able to keep it together all this time, which is not easy. I mean, they are the ultimate kitten herders, I think, and they deserve a lot of support for that. The other thing.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And then one last thing about MIDI before moving on, and that is, I've always sort of seen a division between players and composers. There's some people who play their instruments really well. And there's some people who write really well. You had the Brill Building songwriters, and then you had Jeff Beck playing guitar. And the MIDI really helped break that division down, where players had a lot more power to do composition, and composers had a lot more instruments at their command. They didn't have to go out and try to find people to play what they did. They could make that whole process a lot easier. And then the other thing, before passing along, I'd like to point out somebody else in this room, a guy named Marcus Ryle, who has a lot to do with why we are where we are today. He has a lot to do with MIDI and instruments and all that. He's also easily embarrassed, so I like doing things like this. Over to you, George.
Okay, my name is George Duke. I'm a piano player. And, I actually joined Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention in 1970. And the first... Yeah, and Frank Zappa told me, he says, you need to play synthesizer. So I said, okay, what's that? And so he put an ARP 2600 in front of me, and I said, I can never learn how to play this because of all these wires and these knobs. I thought I was going back to school or something, so I said, I'll have to take a class to learn how to play this. But then I went out to Tom Oberheim's place in Santa Monica, he showed me this little instrument called an Harp Odyssey, which became actually my first synth. And I didn't have MIDI, but then when MIDI came in, I think the first MIDI instrument I had was a Prophet 5 from Dave over there, and it had MIDI. I thought it was the second coming. I mean, it was just like, and then when wireless MIDI came in, I thought it was the third coming. You know, because it freed me up to be able to do all the things that I had in my head. And it's a wonderful thing. I don't want to take up too much time, but I don't even know what to say. It's just a great way to make music. You know, and if you can integrate that with live players, it's an amazing thing. If you know what I mean. Integrated with live players. Okay.
Okay, I'm Tom Oberheim. I've been building, thank you. I've been an engineer making money as an engineer for 56 years. I've started doing musical electronics in 1970, got into synthesizers in 74, 75, before microprocessors. Was doing quite well, 75, 76, 77, and then the Prophet 5 showed up at the NAMM show in the Disneyland Hotel in 1978.
Sorry.
And, no, don't be sorry. We saw we were doomed, and myself and my engineer at the time, a guy named Jim Cooper, we rushed out the OBX, and so I had a little experience with synthesizers, and prior to MIDI, we, following the OBX over the next couple of years, we put out a drum machine and a digital sequencer, and we got them all hooked together, and it was, when it worked, it was really kind of fun, but it was really a difficult situation because we, despite the complexity of a microprocessor-controlled synthesizer, sequencer, and drum machine, they all had microprocessors. When they were all hooked together, we got horrible ground loops. It was really a difficult problem. And Dave tells me that I had some meetings with him and Kakahashi in the early days. I don't really remember that, talking about a universal interface. But we were all off selling the Oberheim system, it was called, with all its problems. And when the MIDI spec, the very first MIDI spec came out, it had a little part in it that sells for about 10 cents. It's called an opto-isolator that solved all the ground loop problems. And when I saw that, I said, okay, this idea is going to work. And over the next few years, there was, I think it started with Dave and showing him, hooking up a machine to a Roland machine at one of the NAMM shows. I don't remember the year that was, and I think it caught people's attention. It was still too early for what we see today because computers were still not really something that everybody had in their pocket. And there were a lot of discussions that it was too slow and whatever, but it shows the genius of Dave and Mr. Kakahashi, that they had the vision to do it right. And it's still around. It's still around basically in the same format it came out in 82, 83? 83.
Roughly,
83.
yeah.
I mean, of course, the thing that helped along, it was not a big consortium of companies requiring years and years of spec writing. They just went off and did it. They did it right, and we're all better for it.
Yes, we are. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I'd just like to add a few other editorial comments. How many of you are Grammy winners? Come on, you can say it.
Couple.
Okay.
Not nominee, but not.
Okay.
I think I hold the record for most nominations without winning.
I would have expected you to have won some by now.
Anybody from Naris here? Maybe they can fix it. You know.
the reason I mention is because I'm not sure how many of you know that actually and he's very shy and about the whole thing, but actually Dave Smith is a Grammy winner because the Recording Academy this year decided to give a technical Grammy to Dave Smith and Mr. Kakahashi for the invention of MIDI.
I should mention that Kakahashi-san is one person who should be here on this panel.
Yes, absolutely.
Because he was obviously a major
Yes.
part of all of this.
And in fact, since Marcus was mentioned, I will explain that we actually had a bigger panel, but the problem is there's no room, so we had to cut it down to 6, and Marcus was one of the people who was going to be on the panel too. It's just the logistics issues. Okay, so now we have here on the panel we have designers, engineers, and we have artists, musicians. Not that designers aren't also artists, or that musicians aren't also engineers. As we all know, there's a lot of cross pollination there.
Therein lies the entire problem of the music business, right?
Yes, it does, exactly.
This is the kind of political correctness that enables the MMA to keep surviving.
Exactly. So I have questions that are somewhat aimed more for the artists and somewhat more for the engineers, but I don't want that to restrict anyone from deciding that they want to answer the question. So here's to begin with. I have a question which is, how does MIDI change how you approach the design of a musical instrument? Now, in the case, Jordan's also an artist and a designer. So I think maybe we'll start with Jordan, and then anybody else who feels compelled to answer that question can just jump in.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about, like kind of the next generation of instruments and how one can use MIDI within that. It's something that's I've been seriously thinking about. I have a program that my company made called MorphWiz, which it's really about offering kind of a next level of expressive control on a playing surface where you can have independent control of every voice, every finger that goes down. You can bend some notes, not the other. You can turn up the volume of one note if you play a 5-note chord and vibrato 2 of the other ones. But then that's all wonderful within a device. But again, how are we going to talk to something else? So, well, the answer, of course, is MIDI. So, it just brings, again, it's interesting because, when you're thinking about the future of expressivity with music, you're also including the magic of MIDI. So I've been working for a while on a concept called MorphWiz MIDI, where you can take this kind of expression, this independent control, where you have notes on like a vertical grid. So if you play a note, it's almost like using a violin bow. So your finger is on the pulse of the music the whole time, and using MIDI to send those messages across. And at this point, you can have kind of both. You can have something right in front of you and it can sound, and you can send your messages over MIDI. In this case, a lot of MIDI information, advanced MIDI, and get some more magic to happen.
Dave?
Over to you, Dave.
Well, there's a number of different directions we could talk about. One of the interesting things about how MIDI is perceived actually has more to do with the design of the musical instrument than of MIDI itself. Like when MIDI first came out, we were all using whatever microprocessors were available at the time, but I think pretty much everybody, all of us, were overtaxing our microprocessors because you want to use the lowest cost device you could, and they weren't very powerful back then anyhow. So you've got it controlling your whole instrument, and oh yeah, you got to handle MIDI too. So like, for example, MIDI was, the old MIDI's too slow thing back then. Well, the note got over there very quickly, but then our microprocessors had to kind of scratch their head and say, oh, here it comes, and how do I do this? And then I got to throw it out there, and it took a long time to do that. And some instruments were famous for being very slow at doing that. But since it had MIDI and MIDI was new, then everybody, oh, MIDI's too slow. It can't handle it. But it was actually the fault of us designers of not properly implementing it. And that's even still true today to a certain degree. People say, well, there's not enough bits, it's not enough resolution. Well, it's up to the instrument designer to slew things and filter the controls that come in so you get a nice smooth transition when you're running controllers in and not have to worry about it. It's proper instrument design. It's not an artifact of MIDI. So there's it's a very complicated thing. It's not just, this is bad, this is good, this works, this doesn't work. It's all part of the package. And anyhow, that's some insight into the inside of the instruments on that.
Well, of course, I'm not a designer, but I am a user. So the whole concept of, in particular, keyboards being able to talk to each other was revolutionary. The idea that you could not just have the sound that was coming out of the keyboard you were actually playing, you could combine it with other keyboards. I mean, you could have an entire array of keyboards around you, like Rick Wakeman did, for example. But now we have the concept of the master keyboard, of course, and then you don't have to have this array. So probably Rick Wakeman thought it was a terrible idea, MIDI. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of being able to use modules as opposed to surrounding yourself with keyboards, I think that was a big plus. And I still sort of basically go with that concept, one keyboard in my studio. I simply don't have room for any more than one, and everything else is either rack-mounted or virtual. So, and virtual instruments are making leaps and bounds, I must say. And they're all using MIDI, as far as I know. I think everybody's using MIDI to control those virtual instruments. So, there's my 10 cents, or my 10p. I come from England.
Well, I'm sort of a half designer because I do a lot of analog circuit design. I've done a lot of analog circuit design, but the digital stuff was always too difficult for me, so I'm glad these guys took care of it. But I will say that...
Is this mic working? Is this working? Sounds very cool.
Just barely? Do you want me to yell? Anyway,
use
but
this one.
oh, there you go. Oh, wow, look at that.
better.
Hey,
Audio.
okay. God, I thought it was at the AS for a second. I know.
Hey, it's an audio convention. The audio, by definition, will be screwed up.
There you go. So, just... I got to tell you, I had a friend who had a sampler, and he had nothing but hums, hisses, buzzes, and crackles. And whenever he set up, the front of house guy would like plug something in, and he'd hit this. It was very cruel. So MIDI's good for practical jokes too. But anyway, what I was going to say was, as someone who does design, even though it's not digital design, one of the things I really appreciate about MIDI is how extensible it has been over the years. I mean, anybody who thinks MIDI is too slow when it's going over USB inside a computer needs to have their head examined. And the fact that the spec was set up in such a way that it's been able to cope all these years and take advantage of new technology is nothing short really of astonishing. And actually, I have a question for Dave. Was that dumb luck, or did you really plan that far ahead?
There's always a lot of dumb luck involved. What, as far as USB? No, I didn't know that there would be such a thing as USB.
And
USB, of course, brings back ground loops.
But really, I mean, to me, it's just astonishing that something has lasted that long. If you think back to what was happening in the 80s, I mean, Ronald Reagan was president, Firewire hadn't happened yet, Depeche Mode Human League was on the top of the charts, and I think Dell had just introduced a screaming fast, like 25 megahertz processor or something like that, and that's the cauldron out of which MIDI bubbled, and to think that it was able to cope in that primitive a setup and still be relevant today is, to me, just actually unbelievable, more than astonishing. What else from that time? Are we still using our Commodore 64s and VIC-20s? I don't think so.
In my booth, we are.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. It's kind of they've said pretty much everything to be said, but from a musician standpoint, it created an interesting dilemma, for us as producers and artists, because in its infancy, when there was only one MIDI channel, you didn't have much to worry about. When all of a sudden it became 16 and more with B banks and C banks and D banks, and being able to be an orchestra, one guy being able to be an orchestra, be a band, do all the instruments, where you didn't call a bass player in, you didn't call a drummer in, because you became the guy. It created an interesting dichotomy, between a musician and how you create music. It totally revolutionized the way we create music. I don't need to even tell you that. But it created the dilemma at the same time of really, how do you deal with this situation? Now, I wouldn't want to get rid of my refrigerator. I'm not saying it's a bad technology. I love technology. But there's a balance, I think, that needs to be struck. And I'm just saying that as a musician because, I love playing with live players. And so I'm kind of in that zone between, I love this, but I love that, and I love the combination of the two. It created an interesting dilemma that I think you guys need to work out as musicians and as artists and composers and producers to keep the music alive, because something happens when musicians get together and they jam. you know, jam sessions, guys getting together and playing together and sharing ideas. When one guy is in there, it changes the way things go. But however, I love MIDI. Believe me, I want to go on record. I don't want anybody to think that I'm saying I'm against MIDI. I am not. I use it every cotton picking day. Still to this day.
Tom, any comments?
Just a short comment about, again, the credit to Dave and Mr. Kakahashi about whether they thought of themselves as visionaries or not. You're all here because you know what MIDI is. I'm sure most of you use MIDI in one way or another, and it's so flexible and there's so many things to do. But what Dave and Mr. Kakahashi came up with, and we use all the time as an instrument designer, it costs under $1. Under $1 to put MIDI on a musical instrument. It might cost a little more to write the software for it, but what they came up with costs about $1. And so we're doing all these wonderful things, and it really didn't add any cost. And it's to me, that's still an amazing thing. So.
You know, I'd like to add something to that, which is, I think one of the reasons why, one of the reasons why MIDI got so accepted was because at a corporate level, making instruments, nobody's head was going to roll if it didn't take off. It wasn't like a $30 expense that got tacked on or something like that. So I thought that the idea of making it low cost, opto-isolator was, again, part of that incredibly intelligent design.
So I especially appreciate the $1 because I did have a short period of time building a system that cost a way lot more than $1 and didn't work as well.
Okay, so let's actually, let's follow the path that Craig just started us on, which is, so what would have happened? What would the world look like today if MIDI hadn't been successful? And you don't all have to answer this, but think about, so MIDI was proposed, and what if all the manufacturers didn't do it? The industry wouldn't have died, obviously, but it would certainly look a lot different today. How would that affect what you are doing today as manufacturers, as artists, as composers? Who wants to?
Yeah, really. I'll start. I can't even imagine, to tell you the truth.
It'd be a real pain in the ass.
Yeah, you're right.
I have a feeling that, you know, because MIDI sequencing became so popular, you know, soon after MIDI was upon us, possibly hard disk recording would not have happened had it not been for MIDI sequencing coming first. Mm-hmm. So maybe we'd still be using tape if MIDI hadn't come along.
Wow.
Some people might like that.
I think that probably most of you have never worked in the computer industry or other industries where standardization of interfaces or whatever is a big thing. Typically, these things take years to develop. Whether we're talking about SCSI or FireWire or, the list goes on and on and on. And these are generally put together by committees from big companies, and they go through rev after rev after rev, and it takes forever, and I'm sure costs more. Whereas MIDI was basically done by just a handful of people. Certain Dave and Kakahashi were instrumental, and it happened quick, and it's a unique situation.
Okay, so clearly we all like MIDI.
Well, one other thing though, Tom, one other thing I think is worth mentioning is that if MIDI hadn't happened, then maybe we'd still be using, you know, the Roland R bus or Tom's system or something like that. There was a desire to make that happen, even to the point where I designed like weird-ass little analog things to do syncing and stuff like that. Just so there was a need to do it. So something would have come out eventually, I think. Yeah. But would it have been as elegant, as cost-effective, as forward-thinking, and everything else? Probably not. It really seems to me like MIDI hit the sweet spot of all those things.
Right. And probably everything wouldn't all be compatible either. You'd have one or two or three different things. Yeah. Okay, so again, we all love MIDI, but let's be honest here. What is there about MIDI that you don't like? What would you change now if you could, or what do you think the future should be with MIDI? Any one of you.
Bigger, faster, more.
A male
Louder.
socket and a female socket, not two female sockets. That's what I would change.
I'd
Because,
say,
Is it a technical reason, or you're just trying
it
to
drives
be
you mad
equal?
because you don't know by looking at the socket whether it's in or out. You know, that's my
Okay.
only.
I'd say uninvent quantizing.
Uninvent quantizing. So you guys really like it that much, huh? Can't think of anything you'd
I
like to
think
change.
that's one for the audience.
Well, we'll get to the audience too, absolutely. Bi-directional, okay.
Self-aware that it knows what it's talking to.
Yep.
No, I'm
But not
kidding.
tuning self.
I'm not kidding. It would be called discovery, I guess, by technical people, right?
Okay.
That wasn't a joke. Although self-awareness, a conscious MIDI system would be interesting. Wouldn't it?
This guy said more channels.
Yep.
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah.
Yep.
More resolution on the controllers.
Well, yeah.
I mean, a lot of companies interpolate to get around that, but it'd be nice to have that out
okay.
of the box.
So let me try to steer it. For example, MIDI was developed for keyboards, so there's a particular paradigm, a model of performance that's involved there. Over the years, there have been many people who've said it isn't good for guitars, it isn't good for certain instruments, other types of exciting instruments, and then there are other people who figured out how to do it. I'm going to kick this to Jordan, because Jordan is actually creating new kinds of instruments using touch screens, which don't have keys and they don't have fixed pitches. Does MIDI work for that?
Well, it is a really interesting topic because things are changing so much, and a lot of the instruments that I'm involved with are these alternate controllers, these forward-thinking ideas, and many of them kind of share a particular view of how to present, the instrument, which is that you're always dealing with like independent touches, independent channels. Every time your finger goes down, a lot of these instruments will, every time you play something, it's going to go out on a different MIDI channel. So if you play a 10-note chord, all of a sudden you're sending this note on channel 1, this note on channel 2, this note on channel 3. And the great thing about this is because it's kind of really pushing the future. Everybody wants to have the, you don't want to play a chord on your keyboard and only be able to use the pitch wheel and have all the notes bend. That's already getting kind of old. You want to be able to play a chord and have one of the notes bend. So how do you do that? Right now, one of the solutions is, well, the main way to do it is to have this instrument that has that capability and then go up to your synthesizer, and at that point you pretty much have to be a rocket scientist to figure out how to get one sound out of an instrument like this. It's really, really hard. And then these companies, and I don't necessarily have to name who they are, they wonder, well, why didn't my instrument sell? It was such a great idea. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's a fantastic idea on many levels and incredible control, but I can hardly figure out how to get like a string sound on all 10 channels, making sure all my pitch bends are the same, making sure all my controllers are the same. It's very, very difficult. So that's something that we all really need to think about, because everybody's going to want to do the kind of thing that you can do on like an iPhone or an iPad or anything like that. And somebody can buy something for $1, for $5, for $10 that offers this kind of capability, but in our more professional world, it's not even there yet. Where we've planted seeds. So this is a really, to me, it's like one of the most important subjects to, consider and think about and move forward.
Do any of you have interest in playing alternate controllers? You ever wish, do you kind of dream about that, about some new controller coming out?
I actually do. There's a couple things. Hi. Thank you, Alan. But I have Alan Parsons as an engineer. Now, is this cool or what?
Wait till you get the bill.
There's a thing called U-Rock Guitar, which is like this little plastic game controller type thing, but it lets somebody, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And you look at it and you go, well, this can't possibly be real, but it allows guitarists to use guitar-type gestures and trigger MIDI. And the other thing is that at this show, there's a thing that Newmark makes called the Orbit. Anybody seen that one? It's basically, they're selling it to DJs. It's like a lit thing, and it's got accelerometers in it. And I was thinking, so what's it generating? MIDI. It's wireless. And I'm going, can you like assign these switches to different things and this accelerometer? And they go, oh yeah, sure. It's like, so I can do a lot more than just trigger tractor with this, right? Yeah, you could. So I think, it's the kind of thing, I mean, it's wireless. If you're in the vocal booth, you need to hit play and record, you can do that. Or if you want to like trigger foot switches, if you're a guitar player. So there's still a lot of options in terms of controllers. In fact, you were talking about the guitar thing. So there you are talking to a guitar player. Oh, I'd never play MIDI guitars. They step on their MIDI foot switch that's controlling their MIDI controlled effects, which are being run by MIDI controlled controller foot pedals. So
It's all MIDI one way or the other, isn't it?
yeah. It all gets, as Alan Parsons once said, it's been in the DNA of every pop music production for the last 20 years.
That's great.
Is there a latency with that wireless controller?
Not that I was able to detect.
Dave, do you ever think of some future time having to create something other than keyboard-based instruments, or?
That's a lot of work.
Yes, it is.
My interest in designing instruments is more usually in the sound generation and the sound capabilities and that side of it. And designing controllers is a very difficult thing because they tend to be very personal to people. People like, if you design your own controllers, that's actually the best way to go, because then you have something you actually like. And it is nice now that there are new surfaces coming out and new ways of doing things. So, some gestures that the kids are learning will actually be something that they could use in music generation, because they're already doing swiping and this and that. So it will continue in that direction. But as far as making, a musical instrument that is based on some sort of a new controller, it's very difficult as a manufacturer to do, because you have a very limited audience as far as who is going to take the time to learn the muscle memory for whatever controller you come up with, because you have to convince them that you're going to buy this instrument that we are making. We're the only ones that are making. We may not make it next year, but we want you to spend the rest of your life learning how to manipulate it so that you can take advantage of it. And that's a lot to ask from somebody. So the idea of decoupling the sound generation from the controllers makes a lot of sense for that reason, because then people can make their little controllers and then they can connect up to the sound generation devices, and using something like, maybe MIDI to go between them would make a lot of sense, and you get the best of both worlds.
We've also lost a couple controller things, though, too, like polyphonic aftertouch is something I absolutely love, and I have these Ensoniq keyboards sitting around that I hope that they never die, so I can use it.
That's the other problem with small companies. You need some pretty heavy-duty mechanical engineering to design those sort of things, and I am not and never have been a mechanical engineer. So if there were a keyboard company out there who built a polyphonic aftertouch keyboard, then I think a lot of companies would naturally put them in their units, because we all buy keyboards from Italy or China or wherever, so we're at their mercy. But I don't do plastic molding, I don't do all that stuff. It's just not in my DNA. So but even when you have it, it was amazing how many people would not, even for something as simple and obvious as polyphonic aftertouch, how many people wouldn't take advantage of it. Because when we had the T8, it did that really well. But still, people just wouldn't take the time to, you could do this and you could do that. And they can kind of see that it was obvious, but then they have to learn how to use it. And even though it's really simple and obvious, it still takes effort and time, and that's ultimately the roadblock in many cases.
George, do you wish that keyboards were more expressive? Do you long for polyphonic aftertouch or some other thing, or?
You always want more.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The more control you have, the better off you are. But the learning curve is a serious event, especially the older I've gotten. Yeah. I don't want to sit there in front of a manual and learn that, But for a young guy, no. I mean, it's wonderful to learn what the capabilities of a controller. I'll go on to say one thing. I'd love to have a keytar, quote unquote, that makes some kind of sense. I've been talking to the manufacturers for years. Say, hey, make me one that I like. Because I haven't found one that I like that has wireless MIDI in it and all this kind of stuff, aftertouch, yada, yada, and can control an instrument, because I like to walk around when I play. I don't like to just sit there in one place, so all show. But it's probably a limited market, but yeah, the more control, the better.
What don't you like about the ones that are out there?
There are a lot of things I don't. If I could combine the ones that are out there into one instrument, I'd be happy. One thing is I'm old school, so I like a wheel. I like to have the option of being able to use a wheel and a ribbon, which I actually had instituted on my instrument. I think certain things that happen, like, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the current controller I'm using now, which I'll remain nameless, actually does not do some of the things that my older controller that fell apart would do in terms of being able to select banks from internal sounds, being able to select banks and patches from a computer, because I use a lot of computer sounds now live, you know. So the layout of it, where the neck is, where your hand lies. I mean, I think when these guys put these things together, you need to talk to some musicians, you know, who actually play the instrument and get them kind of involved. Not that you don't, but I mean, it's, I think that's important.
Good.
I just want to add one thing, which is that, you know, we're at such a funny time right now in our technology music world, where, like, most of us have an iPhone in our pockets or something similar, which is capable to create sound. And in your pocket you probably have like a music app that does things that, you know, 90 to 95% of the things that you'll see on the floor don't do. So something has to give. You know, when you take your phone out of your pocket and do something like really amazing that you can't do on professional musical instruments, you have to think, okay, well, something's going to change. You know, it might be hard to teach somebody, a musician, a new trick, but there are things that I believe that you can show them that would make a whole lot of sense. You don't have to change the whole world around them, and, you know, to the point where they're like, I don't even know what that is. But there are little things that would really make sense at this point in time, because again, you have this thing in your pocket, and then that's over here, and you spent $1 on it, and it does things that all these things over here don't do. So I think that's our you know, situation right now in the music world.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question myself, and then I'm going to open it to the floor. And I know this is going to be a tough one, but I want you all to try anyway. And I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, you've been in this business for 40 or 50 years, you said. If you lived another 40 or 50 years, what do you think you would be doing in this business? Assuming you didn't retire, what would you be doing?
Well, that's an interesting question. Musical instrument design, musical instrument, being in the musical instrument business is a lot different from the computer business or the aerospace business or whatever. It's an area that I think about a lot. We can probably talk about how computers will be different in 50 years, or airplanes will be different, or whatever. But when I look at what has happened in the last 50 years, and I haven't been in a musical instruments quite 50 years yet, but won't be long. I may not make that. But anyway, musicians are an interesting group in that they're interested in technology, but it's not technology for technology's sake. I learned a lesson early about this when George mentioned buying an Odyssey from me. I was my first foray into synthesizers. I was the first ARP dealer west of the Mississippi River, and I sold Frank Zappa his 2600. And
yes, I remember.
before I was selling synthesizers, I'm making ring modulators and phase shifters, and I got to know several musicians. And I got a call one day from Jan Hammer, and who used one of my ring modulators and a lot of this stuff with Mahavishnu Orchestra, and he says, "Tom, I'm about to buy a synthesizer." And I said, "Oh, you got to get an Odyssey. It's really no, I'm not going to get an Odyssey. What are you going to? I'm going to get a Mini Moog. Why? Well, because I like the sound." And I thought, wait a minute. Let's talk about the technology. Who cares about that? He wanted a Mini Moog because the Mini Moog gave him the sound. I mean, he also had a couple of my synthesizer modules and stuff. So I learned that technology's great and we're all interested in it, but it's got to sound right. And I think what we'll see is some growth in the technology that makes some strides in the way we do things in musical instruments, but I think we'll see a lot of what we see right now in 50 years. Certainly, after being out of the business for a few years and seeing Dave come back 11 years ago and bringing back the sort of sparking the analog revolution, which I'm kind of back into a little bit, and seeing other companies doing true analog synthesizers. It's like Bob Moog invented in 1965. So what? It's almost 50 years, and we've got a lot of new machines. We've got MIDI to connect these machines together, but I'll tell you, there's not a whole lot of stuff out there that sounds better than a Mini Moog or a Prophet 5 or some of my stuff. So I think we'll see a modest gain in 50 years in this instrument, in this musical instrument business, but it's not going to be like the technology industry, because there's another element here that will continue to be so important to what we do.
Great. Anybody else want to grab that one? No, I know it's a scary one, isn't it?
Oh, ditto.
Actually, I did want to,
Yeah.
I do.
No, go ahead.
Ditto.
No.
No, I was just thinking about the controller thing. I mean, like Don Buchla did a whole lot of work with controllers specifically tailored for synthesizers, you know, and they took advantage of what the synthesizer could offer. I think some of the most exciting controller stuff going on these days is with DJs. I'm very much into the whole DJ thing because it's another way to relate to sound. I mean, people say, well, DJs aren't musicians. I defy you to see a current controllerist playing like, you know, that has like not only their conventional platter setup, but things to trigger samples, effects processors, tempo sync things. They are really using those controllers and MIDI to create a new kind of electronic music vocabulary. So, and now that we're seeing things like accelerometers built into phones, we're seeing gestures that are possible. There's a keyboard down there on the floor with an accelerometer, so you can actually tilt the keyboard and make changes in the sound. And you know, you might think, well, that's kind of a gimmick, except you can do some really cool things with it. So, if you're looking ahead 50 years or something like that, what I'm seeing with some of the really forward-thinking DJs and some of the forward-thinking electronic musicians and keyboard players, I can see all that converging into almost like a kind of a super instrument that's part studio, part traditional musical instrument, part DJ setup where you're actually deconstructing and reconstructing sound, and the technology makes that easier than ever before too. You can now actually, you know, I've done remixes where I only had a 2-track to work with, but it's possible to extract things from it now to the point where you can really kind of start over from scratch. So all music will get more fluid, more interactive, more malleable, and more accessible to a variety of people who want to do these kind of really creative manipulations of sound, where the sound becomes like paint, you know? It's just sitting there, and what you draw with it is an entirely different thing.
I just have one thing to add to that, which is, what about the poor old bass players, drummers, and guitarists of the world, and who love to play together? And in a world that is too dominated in 50 years or whatever, if the world is too dominated by technology, and the onus is on keyboard players in particular currently. The keyboard player does everything, you know, plays the bass part with his left hand, you know, all that stuff. And you know, I think we have to be careful that we don't lose live music, lose bands playing together.
That's good.
Well, no one's going to stop playing. No one's going to stop playing guitar.
I was
Because
going to
of
say,
other options.
you still look more cool playing a guitar than a
Yeah,
keyboard.
absolutely.
It's a fact of life.
But the other thing is the trend that's really interesting is I'm seeing more and more interaction with DJs because they can sync together. So I'll see somebody with Ableton Live and somebody else with like a Pioneer setup. They're synced together and they have musicians playing with them. So it really, I mean, I've jammed on guitar a lot with DJs, and they love it, because if you can sustain a note when they're doing a transition between songs, it's like you're gold, you know? You can cover the train wreck, and it's a beautiful thing. So, I mean, it's not going to go away, but the thing is, you look at something like the Adrenaline, you know, like Roger Lynn's Adrenaline box, and now all of a sudden, I can speak that language with a guitar.
So some people have said that MIDI democratized the music-making business because it used to be a lot harder to get into it and do anything, and all of a sudden any musician with a synthesizer could create all kinds of sounds and compose. And perhaps the cynical way to express that is, yes, it democratized the music business so that anybody can make bad music. Do you agree, and do you think this will continue? And do you think there's something that in the future will change that?
I think it's all good. You can't start separating what is good solo music, what is good live music. If one person can make really good music, one person can make bad music, a group, and then it's subjective beyond that. You know, what you like is not necessarily what I like. I think there's too much time spent trying to put these things in little compartments and rule them overall as being a good thing or bad. There's just so much going on, so many different directions, live music, you know, studio music. It's all good. It's all music.
Okay, good. How about Alan, as a producer engineer, do you find that things are easier for you now that people have MIDI, or do you find it to be more of a problem sometimes that getting good work
Well,
out of it?
specifically MIDI. Oh, no, I think MIDI definitely made life easier, and it changed the entire standard of you know, timing. You know, we were unable to correct one note in a part until MIDI came along, and now we can you know, we can change timing, we can change sounds, you know, all that stuff. So it was all good, but it was just a development of music. I mean, it's part of music history, there's no question.
Is it good that more people can make music?
Sure. Why not?
Well, this has nothing to do with MIDI, but of course, you know, the copyright issue has become a huge problem, and you know, if we're not careful. If music is made for consumers to get for free, then music can no longer exist.
Okay, good.
You know, Tom, I just want to comment about that democratization thing, because that's been a big deal, I think. And that is that, you know, what is the purpose of making music? You know?
A little closer, if you want.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you, Alan. Could you adjust the EQ too? Do you think it needs a little more high end, maybe? This is great. He's engineering. Okay. What is the purpose of making music? Is it to make it, quote unquote? Is it? Are you there to change the? Are you there to change the audience, or are you there to change yourself, or are you there to do both? And I think that the idea of people being able to express themselves musically is a fantastic thing, because every time you're playing music, it's like looking at a Rorschach of yourself. You know, you get, when you make music, you learn about yourself. And if it's only for you, that's fine. If it's only for your friends and you got 3 people who really like it and they'll click on your YouTube thing, that's great. If you can like fill stadiums, that's great too. But ultimately, filling the stadiums is less important, I think, than the influence it has on people to express themselves. And it's not just, I mean, MIDI opened the door, then hard disk recording, inexpensive interfaces. I mean, you're seeing it at the show, but it's getting to the point now where it's such a beautifully rich thing that people can do that. Plus, it allows them to appreciate musicians more. You know, if they've tried to make music and they listen to Jordan, or they see his app, you know, or they listen to George or whatever, they now know more. It's not just a big wash of sound. You know, like one person said to me after a concert, the bass, that's the flat one, right? You know, it's like, what, the flat one? I may be referring to the shape of the instrument, but now people can pick out bass lines. They can pick out lead guitar parts. They can do this stuff. It's becoming a more musically literate society. And to Alan's point, hopefully they'll go, this music making thing is tough, and we should maybe like support the people who do it really well that we like listening to.
Right. Very good. Okay, I would like to know what some of you people would like to ask these folks up here. Is there anybody who has, oh, good, look at that. So there are microphones. Please jump up to them, and if you need
First
to.
of all, thank you for the tools and the creative inspiration that you've given us and everybody around the world. So, my question, I guess, is a Dave and Tom question, but feel free to jump in. Was the pitch wheel and the mod wheel always there as part of the MIDI spec, or was that sort of an afterthought? And to George, I guess maybe, I think I'm a recovering synclavier owner like you, I think, and we sort of miss our ribbon there in the middle of the. And so,
You mean my second house?
yeah, that was. And so, why did suppose the ribbon never caught on as a MIDI controller? So.
Well, the pitch wheel, I think, was the one controller that was singled out in the MIDI spec on its own, separate from everything else, whereas the mod wheel was just part of a controller, which sliders, ribbons are included in also. So that's a great thing about MIDI is you can make any kind of a control you want, be it a ribbon or a wheel or whatever. You can have 4 wheels if you want and just assign them to a MIDI controller number. There are more instruments that do have ribbon controllers now. Putting a plug in for the Prophet 12 or the Tempest, they both have ribbons on them, in addition to pitch and mod wheels, just because, as everybody's saying, more control is a good thing. So, we do try to sneak those things in on instruments a little at a time so people have a little bit more to play with.
Well, where are you? You were asking what about the pitch? Look, I thought when I first, that's what got me into synthesizers, actually, was the fact that I could bend a note. As a piano player, I always wanted to be able to bend a note like a guitar player, but I couldn't. And when I said, "You can bend a note? Are you kidding me?" Then I said, "Okay, I can get all these outs." I said, "I can play the blues on this thing." That really odd, but I said, "I can find a way to play the blues on this rascal," and that drew me into that. That's really what happened. And I like the wheel because I'm old school. But, the ribbon has its thing, too. I like both.
We have both.
I predict that, we were talking earlier about 50 years from now, I predict in 50 years there'll still be wheels. There'll probably be ribbons and maybe some, I bet you there'll still be wheels.
Yeah.
Okay, next question here.
This question has to do with the MIDI spec. I wanted to know, when was song position pointer or SMPTE implemented in the MIDI to pipe down the MIDI line, and what did it do for the whole MIDI community?
Wow. Who remembers?
remember?
I don't remember.
Somebody out there must remember. That was after just a couple of years, I think.
Yeah.
Probably, I think SMPTE MIDI time code showed up probably 80, that's what I would guess. So 3 or 4 years after MIDI first came out. So before that, it was just clocks, and now it's just clocks, but some MIDI time code in between.
We do actually have records, but I don't remember. If you really needed to know, we could probably look it up. And what did it do is what you're asking. Why was
Yes, what did it do for the musicians, like, time code to 2-inch tape? We don't have that anymore, but, maybe you can explain a little bit what it did for the community.
It was just a better way to synchronize different units that are in a sequencer environment as opposed to a live environment. Initially, MIDI was mostly just a matter of playing notes live and controlling multiple keyboards, but with MIDI time code, you'd actually be able to sync like you would with a tape recorder, for example, because that's where time code was used originally, is on the big master multi-track recorders. So now you actually had a way of positioning a sequencer and syncing it up with some other sort of device that had time code involved, or with film, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of times what happens is, I think in fact of song position, I think there was an addition to the MIDI clock portion of the spec. And I think the clock was there because they knew that they wanted to clock things. Yeah. But it wasn't until maybe a little bit later when someone said, well, what if I want to fast forward to a particular point? How do I know where I am? And so and this is the way the MIDI Association worked, is everybody would suggest these things and someone would say, well, why don't we add this? and then they'd all discuss it and say, yep, we all agree that's how we're all going to do it. So it was added, I'm sure, because somebody came along at some point and said, yeah, I need to be able to fast forward or rewind to a particular point.
That's where tape, of course, fell down terribly because you had to wait for it to find its place.
Right.
It took hours.
Right, it was always numbers on a thing which wasn't that accurate
15-second
anyway.
pre-rolls to get it.
Exactly.
It was a nightmare.
Okay, can we go over here?
Thank you. I was interested in MIDI as far as programming. I like the Oscar. They have a separate unit full of knobs and all the stuff that programmers like. I've only seen that only on one unit. The Oscar was that elaborate. I just wanted to get your view on the future of coming up with interfaces that we programmers can get into the software and have our knobs again and patch chords possibly.
Dave, you've got a lot of knobs, don't you?
Our instruments all have that built in. We're big believers in knob per function interfaces with a whole bunch of knobs and no menu diving. And I should probably put in a big pitch just for musical instruments. Software is great, they sound good, but it just doesn't have, it's not a musical instrument, something that you could have today and play it in 10 years, play it in 20 years. When I developed the Prophet 5, I had no idea that people would still want to use them in 35 years, and they are. And there's a reason for that, because it's a real musical instrument. 35 years ago, when you turned that knob, it did something. Today, when you turn that knob, it does exactly the same thing. You don't have to update your OS. You don't have to buy a new computer. You don't have to do any of that. It always does the same thing. It's like a guitar player. You know, they like a Tele, they like a Les Paul, they like a certain Les Paul built in a certain year at a certain place, certain color, everything about it, because it's a musical instrument, and they sync up with it. There's a relationship with the instrument, and that's what I try to do with my instruments. And that's why I got out of software 15, 20 years ago.
That's a very good point. I mean, musicians like to feel a relationship with their instrument.
Yeah.
It's like the instrument I take on the road, the main keyboard that I use. It's not, one of these instruments that you're just putting a whole bunch of software into and then trying to configure this thing so it works with that and all this. It's an instrument, it's a chord Kronos, and to me, it's an instrument that's cohesive, that I feel like there's a personal relationship with this thing. So it's a very, very good point. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question?
First of all, thank you all for being here today. For those of us out here, it's really like having an audience with Greek gods or something. Right? It's a geek moment here, right? Many of our spouses are like scratching their heads. And it's like Star Trek moment. We're like, wow! Many of you talked about the future of MIDI and the extra things that we would have liked. A lot of manufacturers have circumvented certain parts of that problem by coming up with their own code, automation codes that don't really use MIDI. Banks and patches seems to have just gone haywire. There's talk of the next level of MIDI, the next spec. Can you share details with us yet on how many of these you're going to be able to solve, or how that is proceeding, and whether in this day and age manufacturers are all able to get together like they did 30 years ago to be able to assess these next level of problems, which relates to just what you were talking about, is having a controller that can universally talk to anything without having to rely on different software manufacturers interpreting that spec incorrectly. What's MIDI 2.0?
Okay, certainly I can give my perspective on it, but I think, Dave, for example, already earlier in this session mentioned that trying to do something like MIDI today would be next to impossible because of the size of the industry. Back in those days, there were only half a dozen maybe manufacturers, and to get them all into one room was easy. To get them to all agree was relatively easy because they were all basically trying to do the same thing, and what we were trying to do was actually rather simple at that time. Today, everybody's got a solution. We're much more advanced in what we're trying to what we can do with our synthesizers, and MIDI's, of course, doing lighting and all these things, so you have to consider that. That said, I don't think anybody in the business of selling products and trying to appeal to musicians can ignore when someone says, I really want to be able to do more and I wish MIDI did more. So what I can tell you is that representing the industry association, which is basically, there's 180 companies who support us so that they can have a forum where they can go to talk about what they want to do with MIDI and with future technologies. We are aware of the interest in the marketplace, and we are trying to come up with something that is compelling enough that a significant number of manufacturers would say, okay, that looks like something I could actually invest some time and money in, and I'm willing to go out in the marketplace and try that and see what happens. But as simple as it sounded when I said it, it is not that simple to get something. But I think we are very close, and that's why you've all heard things about it, partly because we want to reach out to manufacturers, more and more of them, because it's all about critical mass, is getting enough manufacturers interested. And so we're reaching out to them and getting them and showing them ideas and building prototypes and engineering things, and I think we're close. But having said that, I don't know if we're ever going to get an agreement. I don't know if enough manufacturers will ever decide they want to do this. And certainly, even if we did this, it has no effect on MIDI, because there's no way, look at the steamroll that MIDI is. It's certainly not going to change overnight. It'll probably be many, 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 many years before you'll see anything that's like MIDI where it's everywhere.
But I submit to you, it's been used as a model even in other industries to watch how all those manufacturers got together 30 years ago. We are reaching that second generation where a lot more manufacturers are starting to scratch their heads again, because we're dealing with audio, we're dealing with video, we're dealing with interfaces, we're dealing with, you talked about drummers, bass players. We have ways of still playing live with all of those people and connecting back and forth with MIDI data to still communicate to their instruments.
Yep.
So take this anniversary and use it as an impetus to take things to the next level.
Thank you, we will.
I think you should plug your website, Tom.
www.midi.org.
Thank you.
There's a public forum up there where you can make comments. There is information about things that we're working on. Again, a lot of it is just very basic overview, because our organization's purpose is to serve the manufacturers, and so it's just for manufacturers to have those dialogues. But once we're done with things, we do announce them on the website, and again, we do try to get feedback from all parts of the marketplace. Mr. Lehrman.
Sure. I also want to thank you for putting this panel together. This is great, and I have a career because of these guys, especially Dave and Tom and Craig, for popularizing what Dave and Tom were doing. I was a latecomer to MIDI. I started, writing MIDI software in 1984. But I just wanted to make a couple of points. I don't really have questions. I just wanted to make a couple of points to expand on what you guys are saying. Polyphonic aftertouch is the great unmined piece of the MIDI spec. There have maybe been half a dozen pieces of hardware out there that use it. And I saw something yesterday, which is CME Keyboards of Singapore has a $99 plastic keyboard that sends polyphonic aftertouch, and it's very sensitive and it's very cool, and you can paste it on anything. It's so small. So I hope that there's going to start a trend. There was a piece of percussion controller that came out some years ago. I'm not going to mention the name. It was an Asian company, came out with a percussion controller. I took it home and I started analyzing it, and I realized it was putting out polyphonic aftertouch. And I called up the company in California, and I said, "Do you guys know you're making a product with polyphonic aftertouch?" And they said, "What's that?" So
it was in the specs, so they put it in there, right? But they had no idea.
Well, no, it was the engineers in Japan that put it in there. That LA didn't know what this thing, what was in there. So anyway, now they know. But I just wanted to talk about what Jordan does and expand on that. That I think the whole future of controllers is going to be touch surfaces, and I think the iPad is probably the most important thing to happen to MIDI since MIDI timecode, which is when we were able to start doing film scoring with MIDI. And that the idea of being able to design your own touchpad interfaces to do anything you want, and that's what's happening because programming for the iPad is really very easy. I think that's where it's going, and we're going to see larger touch surfaces. If you've seen this thing, the Raven, which is this giant touch surface that they're running Pro Tools, well, think about a whole orchestra made out of a touch surface. And I think that's...
How sad.
Nah. You can tap dance on it, man.
I'm a guitar player, man. Give me a break.
Well, you can draw a guitar on it and do this. And so I think that this type of stuff that Jordan is doing, which I absolutely adore, is really going to be a big part of the future of what we're going to see, which is going to be these two-dimensional and three-dimensional, touch surfaces, which are going to be user programmable, and you won't need to be a rocket scientist and go through menus to do it. You can just draw things and say, "I want it to do that," and that's what you're going to end up with. So, thank you.
Good. Next.
Okay, let's see if I can get through this. This is a lot being in front of you guys right here. This question is more related to digital sound design, which wouldn't really be around if it weren't for MIDI, and I thought that Alan and Jordan might have a good take on this. I've I found myself several times playing Dark Side of the Moon for people who had never heard that album before and saying, try to forget the fact that nowadays, you know, you hear so many things that you've never heard before, right? I mean, you can listen to electronic music for an hour, you'll probably hear 20 things you've never heard before. But try to imagine the fact that these guys on this album made sounds that people had never heard before and did things in ways that people had never done them before. And that was such a huge deal at that time, you know, and then, okay, we go through and listen to it. So do you think that that people have become almost desensitized to like new forms of sound and new forms, like you can buy a synth program with 50 gigabytes worth of sound that you've probably never heard before, you know, so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
That's a good question.
Well, Dark Side of the Moon, of course, was pre-MIDI. It was pre-anything digital. Interesting, I just had it pointed out to me just this week that there is not a single acoustic guitar on Dark Side of the Moon. Anybody ever thought about that? It's really mind-boggles. I think it was just, you know, it was just a well-executed, well-thought-out, performed piece of music, well-written. And I think that's the entire basis of its success. I don't think it was about technology at all. I mean, I really don't.
Yeah, I'll mention. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, you know, to me, like hearing On the Run, Dark Side of the Moon, that was like a new sound. There was sounds, I mean, I'd heard things like it, but to a lot of people, there were brand new sounds. You'd never heard that. You'd never experienced that kind of sequencer sound that kind of goes through your head in that trippy way. And it was, you know, it was a time when a lot of that was happening. It's a really good point. So I've been talking to a lot of musicians these days, and a lot of them are telling me, you know, I don't really hear anything new these days. And, you know, and maybe it's because they have every plug-in, and there's so many sounds.
That's right.
But on the other side of that, basically any sound you can imagine is possible now. I mean, you have these synthesizers where you can put up the spectrum of frequencies on the screen and take a paintbrush and just basically, you know, erase or draw in what you want from it. That's pretty, for me, it's incredibly exciting. I'm not one of the jaded ones, although I have a million plugins as well. I'm still excited about sound, but for some reason, we are at a point when there's a lot of people kind of saying, you know what, I've heard all these sounds, you know, I've heard them all before. So it's definitely something going on.
Yeah, I was going to say part of it is this, because I went through the same transition. And when I was playing analog synthesizers, I was the programmer. There was no way to save patches. You created the sound. And you found something that you like, and you put all these little marks on the synthesizer so you could get back to it, especially in a live situation. So the musician was the actual sound designer. When all of a sudden you could save things and became digital, then all of a sudden most musicians, at least me, it became a little more complex. And I couldn't really, you know, I didn't want to go back in there and say, oh, but I got to go back to school to learn how to use this stuff and program all these new sounds that I really was hearing in my head. And I said, well, all these patches, you know, I certainly can find something that I like, you know, and I usually try to find something and then adapt it a little bit, but it didn't start from scratch. And I think that's partially what happened. And I think with these guys developing digitally controlled analog synthesizers now, that's going to change a little bit if the mindset of you guys change.
I'd like to add one thing about the sound thing, and that is if you're not hearing new sounds, then you don't have an internet connection. There's so much stuff going on these days, it's accessible now, like reggae was a new sound. You know, not a new sound in the sense of like no one had heard a guitar before, but no one had applied a guitar like that before. You can get, I love Zouk, I really like soca, you know, and you can find that on the internet. You can tune in a high life station from Ghana. A lot of the dance music stuff that's going on is incredible in terms of the sound design. I mean, it puts movies to shame, the depth of the sound design. And plus now we're starting to get people who are creating new sounds based on digital technology that you really couldn't do before. I remember I was working at Apostolic Studios, and Frank Zappa was in there before, and he had all these little reels of 3.5-inch tape labeled like dynamite blurch injector and stuff like that. And they were all like, the wall was just festooned with all these little pieces of tape. Well, now you can like cut all that stuff up. You have things like stutter edit, and you can do those. I mean, music concrete is back. If you listen to trance music, music concrete is here. hear. People are cutting things up, they're stuttering things, they're like dividing, and we're getting a whole vocabulary of new sounds that way. So I don't see, yeah, okay, you can buy a keyboard that has a zillion pianos in it, but that's not where the action is right now. There's a lot of sounds out there. Just go grab them, make them.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Next over here.
Thank you very much for your contributions, gentlemen. Forward-thinking electronic musicians are starting to gravitate towards a protocol known as OSC, Open Sound Control. I'm wondering if you're aware of it and if you see any barriers. To me, it seems like the best answer to the MIDI bandwidth problems or the MIDI bandwidth state. And lastly, Mr. Duke, there's no name for the emotion I feel when I hear your song "Reach Out" from 1983. There's no name for that. I cry every time.
It's probably five.
Who wants to talk about OSC?
Who knows enough about it to talk about it?
Well, you could say why you don't know about it, maybe.
Well, OSC, there have been a number, well, I don't know how many, but there have been some good efforts towards coming up with a replacement for MIDI, OSC being one of them. And the problem, again, as a designer, it becomes a chicken and egg thing. I'm not going to put it in my instruments if nobody has it in their instruments, and they're thinking the same thing. And then there are other like I said, there are multiple people who come by every trade show and say, well, we've got this new thing and it's almost done and it works well. And I have no doubt that it does, and it's probably better than MIDI in a lot of ways because it is new and faster and bigger and more and better and all that.
Louder.
And louder, yeah. It goes up to 11. But the problem, again, as a designer, it's that critical mass issue of, okay, I'll do it if you do it, but you do it first. And in a lot of cases, because some of the interfaces are so much more capable, it puts a much bigger burden on the on the instrument designer to implement it. So not only do we have to do MIDI, because MIDI always has to be there, and we do whatever we want to do already for the sound engine and whatever's going on in our instruments, but now we have this whole new thing that has to be implemented and implemented correctly. So it's a huge thing. I mean, we're a tiny company. There's only 8 of us in the company, only a couple of us doing software. So to add something big like that would be huge, and I'm not going to do it if nobody else is doing it. So I have no answer for that problem, but
Right.
that has been the problem for the last 20 years.
I can also, because there isn't Dave made the excuse, well, I'm just a small company, but I can speak for large companies because we talked to them about this kind of thing, and I'd let them talk if there was one here. Picture Yamaha, for example. If they were going to implement OSC, they have the same problem as Dave, but you would describe it differently. Namely, they have 200 products that they have to put it in. So the fact that you're a small company isn't the only reason. Even if you're a large company, it's going to be, oh my God, I don't have the resources to do this kind of thing unless it's going to be successful, and then no one knows until it's successful. So it's a chicken and egg problem. It's the beauty of MIDI and the whole problem of MIDI in the first place. It was successful. Over here.
Okay, I was going to ask about OSC and its irrelevancy, but apparently that already happened. No, because I'm just seeing it as kind of invisible. As a manufacturer of a MIDI controller, no one's asked me about OSC in a year that I've been out. Sure. So I'm like, why is that? But my question from a technical side is MIDI sufficient conduit for new languages on top of it, like this type of thing where you have 16 gestures that you want to do and you want to communicate information about each of them? Well, you've got a limit of 16. That seems kind of, like the channel limit seems like a kind of big deal. So is MIDI sufficient conduit for new MIDI languages, or do we really need something else at this point? That's the question.
I think he's aiming that at you.
Me. Oh, lucky me.
General aim, but yeah, I would start with.
Or maybe Jordan and Dave, yeah.
Well, there's no doubt that MIDI will choke at some point if you throw enough stuff at it. MIDI over USB fixes most of that as far as just bulk timing, but even now you still get back to the point that the target instrument has to be able to handle it properly and effectively. Not every instrument out there is multi-timbral, for example. And if you're not multi-timbral, which you don't need multi-timbral if you're just playing an instrument. I mean, you're up on stage, you play something, it doesn't have to do 16 different sounds at once. So it depends on the instrument's purpose and the design. But standard MIDI already can do most of what you want to do, but there is a limit. And yeah, I don't know, I guess with improvements that are possibly going to come eventually, some of those limits will go away.
Jordan?
I mean, I think that we're at that point where, you know, it's obviously getting more and more important to have the next level of it. So I mean, there's like no avoiding it because people want that kind of control. Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, this is Tom's job.
What was the secret of getting the manufacturers to accept MIDI in the first place?
Well, there are two things. First of all, they didn't all agree. I tried to get them all to agree. I had a meeting at the NAMM show here a year, I guess 31 years ago, and I invited everybody who was making any sort of keyboards at the time, and they all came. And it was fairly quickly obvious that most of them probably were not going to get on board because it was some cases it was not invented here, some cases even then it was too slow, some cases it was the wrong interface. I mean, a variety of reasons, and I can't speak to all of them. So basically what happened, it was just 5 companies that got, as probably most of you know, that went away, and we said, well, looks like nobody else wants to do it, so we're going to do it. And it was Sequential Circuits, Roland, Korg, Kawai, and Yamaha. So actually everybody didn't do it. I knew it was going to work because my opinion was those 5 companies had enough critical mass that if we all did something, then everybody else would have no choice. And I think that's probably true today. If you can get Roland, Korg, and Yamaha to agree to do something, that would probably be all you'd need to do. Because everybody else would, well, if they're doing it, we kind of have to. I think probably those 3 companies are the critical mass now.
Yep. David?
This is a future of MIDI question. There's been a lot of talk about controllers, which is sort of a master-slave relationship, but Craig was talking earlier about more of a bidirectional idea. And thinking about MIDI, it's really a way of communicating. And on one hand, you've got remote controls, and we've all got a ton of remote controls on our coffee table. On the other hand, you've got cell phones, where the interesting thing is the communication, and it's more of a peer-to-peer relationship. So looking at the future of MIDI as a bidirectional protocol where people are collaborating, what types of activities do you imagine?
Sounds like a musician question.
Collaborating through MIDI alone? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's more, Craig was starting to talk about, you've got a DJ, for example, and the DJ is working together with the guitarist, and they're trading musical information back and forth. It's not a one-directional, I've got my remote control and I'm making something happen over there, but it's, I've got my cell phone and I'm doing something interesting, and Dan over there has got his iPad and he's doing something interesting, and it's going back and forth and building rather than being a master-slave relationship. How would you use that musically and as an instrument design?
Or would you want to?
Oh, yeah, you do. I mean, the first thing, I play with a guy over in Germany, and the first thing he does is he takes a MIDI cable from his MPC, puts it into the Adrenaline, you know? So like we're automatically synced up, and then what comes out of the guitar goes into the mixer, and he brings it in and out. So basically I'm a loop, and he brings me in and out along with the other musicians. So there's a huge amount of interactivity. Now it's all synchronized, but there's also audio going back and forth, and also we can serve as side chains to each other. So that, I think that's kind of more the kind of thing you're talking about. And what that does is, or for example, another thing is having drums as a side chain controlling a gate on a guitar now, or on a bass. Now all of a sudden you have this incredibly super tight rhythm section. I mean, inhumanly tight, but so wonderful. And if he's using swing on the drums, or if a real drummer is playing along with it, then that feel gets imparted into the other instruments as well. I think it's a fascinating thing, and I think it's good for audiences too, because it has the advantages of the electronics, but it has the live performance feel, and it has the interaction amongst different people, which of course is what it's all about. So as George has so eloquently stated.
Is the guy in Germany, I mean, you're working over the internet with him in Germany? Or
No, this is playing live. This is
playing live?
Yeah, playing actual concert situations.
That's
No, he doesn't like to collaborate over the internet. He says if he can't look me in the eye while we're both having beers, it's not worth doing. And you know, he's right. It's
Next.
Hey there. I teach MIDI at a university, Middle Tennessee State, recording industry program, and I got a couple of questions about the spec that I'm just, I love your book, MIDI for Musicians, and so forth. Dave, you mentioned earlier that pitch bend was given its own message. So one thing I've always wondered is why there were two data bytes for that message, but it's like only one is used. If you go like record pitch bend, you get these big jumps. Why don't we have 14-bit resolution for pitch bend? So I'm just curious about that. Also, what's up with mode 2? I mean, has that ever really been used?
I don't even remember what that is. I do know there was at least one mode that was added because at least one company misunderstood what one of the other modes was, and unfortunately put it into an instrument that sold a couple 100,000 units, so we had to make a mode to work. I don't remember the details of pitch bend and why we did things back, but it does get back to pitch bends jumping and so forth, and if they do jump even at 7 bits, that's improper instrument design. It's not a MIDI issue. That's because it's easy to fix that by just interpolating and filtering. So even if you get rough data coming in, it should sound smooth when you hear it.
Well, I would assume it's based on the physiology of hearing, that you're more sensitive to pitch variations and volume variations, right? I mean, the ear's very sensitive to pitch, so I could definitely see why you'd want to put more data in there. Yeah,
especially at the high frequencies.
Yeah.
You need more data to keep the stepping from having.
Yep.
I'm sorry to say this room for one more question only. So, Jeff?
There's no zipper noise on.
Why don't we have hover cars yet?
That's the perfect question.
Why don't we have what? I didn't hear it.
What did he say?
Why don't we have hover cars?
We didn't hear what you said.
Yes, why don't we have hover cars yet?
Okay.
So seriously, kind of two segments to the question, and they're interrelated. One is controllers beyond touch surfaces. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? What are you excited about? Are we going to get to MIDI, direct brain to MIDI control in our lifetimes, et cetera?
Speaking of hover cars.
we have that. It just goes through your fingers.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Craig. And the second part of the question is, I'm really into the idea of synesthesia, of audio and visual synthesis, and I'm struck by the lack of the visual aspect in this day and age of what musicians can do, or the tools that are out there, the lack of tools that are out there to really be able to perform as an audio-visual artist. And
you need to go to more clubs.
Yeah. One person?
No, I said you need to go to more clubs.
Right, but I mean, not just like a DJ and a VJ, and maybe that's what you're saying.
Well, even Ultravox, when Ultravox tried, I guess it was in the 80s, they had a whole light thing that was triggered by MIDI. It was a brilliant setup. The whole stage was painted gray, and then they brought their own lights. It was all MIDI controlled, and it was all like synced perfectly. It was brilliant. We could definitely use more of that.
Right. But that's more like a production. I'm talking about more like an instrument, like being able to perform as a person on stage who's actually controlling, even improvising, the audio-visual experience as an instrumentalist, with the visuals being
I think
part
we're all
of.
sound people and not video or visual people. That's a whole different discipline. So I certainly wouldn't want to get into video stuff just because I'm more interested in what I hear than what I see. I don't know who would do something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting because this shows one divergence between Dave and Mr. Kakahashi, because Kakahashi-san actually did create a video-controlled MIDI protocol because he believes that musicians would like to do visuals. And so we have something called MIDI visual control, which is a specification for using MIDI keyboards and devices to synchronize essentially, lighting or image changes or whatever, any kind of video thing. I would also say it's not hugely successful, so it doesn't prove that there really is a market, but actually Mr. Kakahashi thought there was a market. So,
but in that situation, it's the keyboard player once again taking over the entire.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's more of a collaborative thing. I mean, you know, there are people who are visual artists, and they can work with the people who are audio artists and do something more powerful than the audio artist trying to, you know, be a visual person too.
It depends. I keep thinking if Frank Zappa were alive today, that's exactly what he'd be doing.
I want to chime in just because
maybe on a guitar.
I want to chime in just because I spend a lot of time thinking about and also working on the connection between audio and visual. And the reason that I got into the software business is because of that. Because pretty much in my brain, it's all connected. So the first app that I put out was called MorphWiz, and the whole idea of it is that you're basically morphing between, you know, waveforms that you can hear, and you're also seeing the morph in the visual domain. So what I love, what I'm passionate about, is a couple of things. One is giving in this case, the instrumentalist, let's say, the information, the visual information about what's going on. And then if there's an entertainment value that could be put on a screen, well, then that's even better. So kind of getting both things, getting the advantage, like on a tablet, of having the visual feedback, because people want to see what's going on, you know, in front of a keyboard, unless there's like a beautiful instrument, like something with amazing knobs on it, where you can actually organically go and change things, you know, that's great. But if there's nothing there, if it's all digital, then you know, you're not getting a lot of information. But I think the most beautiful thing is if you can have both. You can get visual information, you can have something, you know, entertaining. If you want it just to be something that looks cool on the screen, then fantastic. I think it's really important in this day and age with the computers that we have and the potential we have for creating instruments and experiences, that these two things come together even more. So
it's interesting you said that, because the one thing that bothered me about all these digital instruments that came out after the whole analog revolution is that you couldn't morph sounds, because I used to be able to change one timbre into another timbre with analog instruments in the middle of a solo, whatever, and I was locked in with digital instruments. I couldn't change anything, but that's not the case now. You guys are changing that around, so that's a good thing.
Great. Unfortunately, these gentlemen all have places to be, so can we thank them for coming? And